Alright guys, in this video and the next one we are going to be talking about probably the most famous period as far as popular culture is concerned of Japanese history, and that is the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war. So in this video, in order to get to the Sengoku Jidai, we need to talk about the end of the Kamakura Bakufu and the early Muromachi, otherwise known as the early Ashikaga Shogunate. So roughly 1300 to about 1477, so about 170 years roughly. So what you're looking at on the screen is a rough outline of what we're doing in this video. So initially we have the Genpei War, which goes between 1180 and 1185, which sees the Taira fighting against the Minamoto. The Minamoto win, they establish the Kamakura Shogunate, which is the first shogunate to really exist in Japan. After that, it basically ends with the rebellion of Emperor Go-Daigo between 1333 and 1336. That fails, and then we see this period between 1336 and 1392, where the Imperial family basically is caught up in a much larger civil war in Japan, and we have a northern branch of the family and a southern branch of the family both fighting for legitimacy, and Ashikaga Takauji is running around technically supporting the northern court, but he eventually establishes his own shogunate. This is the Muromachi, and then in 1467, the Onin War begins, which lasts between 1467 and 1477, and that basically starts the Sengoku Jidai. So now that we have a rough idea of what we're doing in this video, let's start diving into more detail. So I've mentioned in other videos that one of the ways you can look at Japanese history is as a pendulum, swinging from an emphasis on Japan to an emphasis on the outside world, and then going back and forth. So during the Nara period, it was all about China. The Japanese wanted to implement Chinese culture. They wanted to bring in Chinese philosophy, Chinese ways of doing stuff to, at least in theory, beef up Yamato control in Japan. Well, during the Heian period, that pendulum swings back to an emphasis more on the Japanese side of things, and it's during the Kamakura period that it swings back towards the mainland. So during the Kamakura period, the Japanese, not only the imperial court and the shogunate located at Kamakura, but also other trading towns, cities, regional lord, etc., have contact and they have relations with Korea, with Song Dynasty China, with multiple states or things that kind of sort of look like states in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, definitely the Ryukyu Islands. So there's a lot of interaction going on with the mainland. And in 1271, this starts changing a little bit because the Mongols come and they conquer China. So in 1271, the Chinese Song Dynasty is basically pretty much fully conquered, and Kublai Khan sets up the Yuan dynasty. So what is now happening is there's a new dynasty ruling China and Mongolia. This is the Yuan. So the Japanese have that to deal with. They have relations still with the Koreans, who are technically under Mongol domination, and now there are still pirates basically plaguing the waters in between all the countries. So it's in this general political environment that things like new forms of Buddhism, so stuff like Zen, which we talked about in the previous video, things like tea, the concept of using bricks of tea as money, stuff like that, Chinese art forms, Korean art forms, etc., flow into Japan. But very quickly, this changes towards the end of the 1200s, and it changes because of political and military developments, because Kublai Khan wants to bring the Japanese islands into the Mongolian Empire. So in 1274, and again in 1281, he launches an amphibious invasion of the Japanese islands. So you want to be really technical. The crews of these ships were primarily Korean and primarily Chinese, but the soldiers were a mix of multiple different peoples the Mongolians controlled. Primarily, it was Koreans, Chinese, and Mongols, but there were some others in there as well. And they attempted landing first at Hakata Bay in Kyushu, so relatively close to the mainland. The Japanese kind of got some form of advance warning, or at least we think they did, and they developed a series of fortifications in the region. The Mongolians attempt to land. It doesn't work. They're beaten back by the samurai. They do this again in 1281. Same thing happens. The samurai beat the Mongolian landing parties back. And then both times, according to legend, according to the war tales, the Gunkimono, the divine winds come. So a typhoon or something that is described as being like a typhoon comes and destroys both Mongolian fleets. For a very long time, this was taken literally, and then it was kind of looked at as, well, maybe not, and it shifted back and forth, and now that we've done, like, stuff like, underwater archaeology, so basically archaeologists wearing scuba suits and checking out the wrecks in Hakata Bay, we've determined that, yeah, there probably was a storm that came through. A lot of the ships there looked like they had storm damage, so there probably is some truth to what the Japanese stories tell us about how this all went down. Now, in this period, in the late 1200s and early 1300s, when there was combat of some kind, and I don't mean like a duel, I mean like actual, like a rebellion or a war, something like that, the samurai would submit to their commanding officer, their general, their lord, somebody of much higher rank than them. They would give them a battle report or a war report. Basically, what it is it's a document or several documents that state the samurai's name. So I am this person. My lord is this person. I did X, Y, and Z on the battlefield. I fought these people. I killed this guy. I wounded this guy. I took this guy's head. This guy still had his head on his corpse, so I took that off. So here it is. I did all these things, and this samurai or these samurai, so somebody he knows, is my witness, and then that witness would basically attest to, yes, this individual samurai did all these deeds that are listed in this battle report. You submit the battle report, and based on what you did, the lord or your commanding officer or your general, somebody, is supposed to give you a reward. So this might be money, this might be land, this might be a new suit of armor. They're supposed to reward you in some way for your service. So the problem here is that initially, yeah, the shogunate's able to reward some of the samurai, but not all of them. And as reports keep on coming in, the shogunate realizes that they basically don't have the resources to reward all of these warriors. So you have this large body of disaffected samurai who are not able to get what they feel they deserve for risking their life in battle. So we've got that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have the gradual increase of money in the Japanese economy in the late 1200s, early 1300s, where the samurai are, to an extent, kind of living on a combination of like fixed stipends and what they're supposed to get from the battle reports. This income is not something that really keeps up with inflation to the extent that it existed. This income is not something that really increases or decreases over time. It's kind of fixed, and it's supplemented by battlefield report rewards. So over time, the samurai start wanting an elegant, wealthy lifestyle. They're not able to really get it because their incomes just don't allow them to. So all of that is leading to this large body of disaffected samurai, and then we have some political instability towards the end of the Kamakura period, which basically combines with that, and it helps take down the Kamakura Shogunate. So in 1324, there is an imperial uprising. It does not work. It fails pretty quickly. And then in 1331, Emperor Go-Daigo launches a second uprising. So this is what's known as the Kenmu Restoration, and it lasts until 1333, so just about 3 years, really 2.5 years. This is a subject which has seen a lot of study recently. It's not entirely certain how Go-Daigo wanted to go about restoring imperial power. All we know is that he wanted to do this. So he's launching a rebellion against the Kamakura Shogunate, which is dominated at this point by the Hojo family, and he is calling to his banners a lot of these disaffected samurai. So, in order to deal with this rebellion, because it is bigger than previous revolts, the Hojo send one of their vassals, this guy Ashikaga Takauji, to go defeat Go-Daigo, but upon reaching Go-Daigo's area, that is the land he controlled in Japan, Ashikaga changes sides. He becomes a turncoat. Later developments in Japanese history, later historiography would kind of vilify him for doing this to such an extent that critiques of later Japanese policies in the 16 and 1700s are really, they're talking about Ashikaga Takauji when they write their histories, and they're criticizing him. Really, they're using him as a way to criticize what's going on in the 16 and 1700s. So this legacy of him being a turncoat really lasts for hundreds of years. So he goes over to Go-Daigo's side. He then goes back to Kamakura and he crushes the Hojo for Go-Daigo. But then there's a series of issues within the imperial court and between Ashikaga Takauji and the court, which leads to Takauji setting up a branch of the imperial family in northern Honshu. So thus we get the Nanbokucho Jidai, the war between the courts, otherwise known as the northern-southern court period, which goes between 1336 and 1392. So it's a civil war that lasts approximately 60 years. It sees a lot of guerrilla fighting. It sees a lot of developments in warfare, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's in this environment that Ashikaga Takauji establishes the Muromachi, otherwise known as the Ashikaga Shogunate, which lasts between 1336 and 1573, roughly. So I mentioned that in this period the warfare changes. Well, how and why does it change? So the late Kamakura period had serious issues with taxing the country and establishing some kind of a long-term fiscal or a long-term budgetary plan. So, in order to get around this, in order to make lords basically, to give them an incentive to basically collect taxes to an extent that they were not doing so before, in 1351, so just after the Kamakura Shogunate ends, and really just at the beginning of the Muromachi period, the Hanzei Edict is passed. So basically, what this does is it takes local samurai and local provincial governors and other local provincial powers that had risen in power over the past 100 to 200 years, and it allows them to keep approximately a third to a half of all the tax revenues from the land they control, or from the land that they're supposed to be collecting taxes from. And this is done for two reasons. One, it's done to help build up a military fund in order to basically help protect the land they control. And it's also trying to, in a way, bribe them by allowing them to keep a decent chunk of the tax money they collect to actually go out and really ensure that the taxes were formally collected. So the result is that armies are able to grow, and many places in Japan now have actual armies, not vassal relations. So not stuff like, I'm the lord and you are my vassal. I'm giving you control over this land, and in exchange for like 40 days a year, let's say, you have to give me 2 archers, a swordsman, 2 cavalrymen, and maybe 5 spearmen. So these like almost purely verbal agreements, sometimes are written down, but these like formal agreements whereby people are granted land and they have to give like a very small amount of troops based on the amount of land they control. Now what happens is, because there is money involved to such an extent that it was not involved previously, people are able to get larger and larger, or build rather larger and larger militaries, because they're able to pay these troops. So they go on a wage basis. They're able to provide them with armor, and they're able to provide them with weapons and actually train them. So this leads to wide-scale changes in warfare. So the evidence in the 1300s isn't that great. But what we have document-wise for 1336 tells us that there are at least 1,600 men under arms, basically all across the country. So these are not really large armies, but only about 200 really actually are recorded as fighting. You skip ahead to the end of 1300, and we now have thousands of people recorded as being under arms, with hundreds of people fighting. So my point is, what this leads to is drastic changes in warfare. Society is becoming more organized for warfare, definitely for longer, more protracted conflicts, and it leads to local samurai and local shugo, so the governors of provinces, becoming significantly more powerful than they previously were. So, in 1338, Ashikaga Takauji is formally granted the title of shogun. So, technically it starts in 1336, but really it's in 1338 that the Ashikaga, or Muromachi, Shogunate really gets started. But by the time of Ashikagayoshimitsu, so the third Ashikaga Shogun, the Ashikaga have a bit of a problem. So the Nanbokucho Jidai ends in 1392, and it doesn't end with like one side being victorious militarily over another. It ends with the Ashikaga basically forcing the northern and southern branches of the imperial court to come to an agreement whereby peace will return to the country, the families will keep their distinctiveness, and the emperor is going to alternate between the southern and the northern families. So each branch is going to place an emperor on the throne, and it's going to alternate. Well, eventually the northern branch comes to dominate this, and this is a huge issue going up until the present day, because technically speaking, the northern branch was the illegitimate branch of the imperial family. So if the northern branch family is still on the imperial throne, and back in the 1300s they were the illegitimate branch, well, is the current emperor illegitimate? How do you rectify this? This is something we're going to talk more about in the second series when we talk about, people like the Meiji Emperor and Hirohito. But for our purposes here, this is the agreement that basically returns peace to the country. But the problem is that warfare lasted for so long. And the problem is that local lords and local samurai are able to develop such a power base in their own local areas that by the time of Ashikagayoshimitsu, so the third Ashikaga Shogun, he's in control of Japan, but not really. The Ashikaga rule is never really stable. Ashikaga Takauji's rule definitely is not really stable, and Ashikagayoshimitsu's rule, despite the wealth he's able to pour into Kyoto, which is a golden age of culture, is never really that stable. They have to work with other leading families. So Ashikagayoshimitsu specifically has to work with the Shiba, the Hosokawa, and the Hatakeyama families, all of which are these newly powerful samurai families. And basically what happens is he has to rule with them. So the Ashikaga have the title of shogun, but these three other families act as alternating shogunal deputies. So there's a new shogun who comes onto the scene, and one of these families basically acts as regent, helping them rule the country. So same thing that the Soga and the Fujiwara and others have done with the emperor. They're kind of pulling strings behind the scenes. So this would be fine if this agreement kind of played out just like this over the next 100 years, but it doesn't. After Yoshimitsu dies in 1408, Ashikaga control continues to slip. So going along with this rise in newly militarized aristocracies and more powerful samurai families, the Ashikaga period also sees a rapid series of economic developments and changes in Japan. So we have technical improvements, so things like improvements in salt making, mining, metalwork, pottery, sake brewing, armor manufacture, weapons manufacture. Road systems are improved. There appear to have been improvements in the development of ships. So stuff like that. All of this increases the economic affluence of farmers and merchants and artisans, and this ties in with the Hanzei Edict. So local lords want to increase the money supply to increase the size of their armies. So what they start doing is they start investing in cash crops, and they invest more broadly in agricultural production. And due to these investments, villages and towns start growing in large numbers, their population increases, and eventually we get guilds in towns of sufficient size to attempt to maintain some kind of a standard over crafts and set prices. So the result of this all is basically twofold. So the first result is that the lord or the governor or the samurai increases their money and the size of their armies. The second result is that this doesn't always go according to plan, and sometimes villages grow rapidly enough and they become extremely powerful through economics that they're basically able to become stronger than the lords they were subordinated to. And this is something we'll talk more about in the second video as well. But in the 1400s and going into the 1500s, so the Sengoku Jidai, there was a drastic rise in autonomous village units in Japan, which is going to alter the balance of power. So many of these villages are comprised of farmers, merchants, and lower-ranking samurai. So these are what are typically known as Ji-samurai. So you have the title of samurai. Technically, that's your social station, but you're not really wealthy. Maybe you have hand-me-down armor. Maybe you have an old sword. Maybe you have an old spear. And maybe you have some land, but you have to farm your own land. You can't have another person do it for you. And it's in the 14 and 1500s with this general political chaos going on. Yeah, the Ashikaga have control, but like not really. Many of these villagers and larger village networks form what are called iki. So this is something we'll talk about a bit more in the next video. But just to get an overview here. So iki are autonomous self-defense leagues. So what iki do is they stress the general equality of all of their members. So a contract or some kind of a constitution, some kind of founding document which binds everybody together is signed, and it's signed with the names going in a circular fashion, with the idea being that, well, if we're signing our names in a circular fashion and not someone's name is up top and then someone's name is below them, which can imply like a hierarchy or something along those lines, if we sign the names in a circular fashion, then we're all equal. Nobody's above anybody else. And then sometimes these documents are burned, the ashes mixed with water, and they are consumed. So this represents a symbolic dedication to mutual defense and protection. So it's through units like this, going into the 14 and 1500s, that villages are basically able to stand on their own against powerful samurai families. And if a lord wants to do something, yeah, he might have a military, but really, he's got to deal with these powerful villages in his local area. So villages become a very strong counterweight to local samurai families. So because I'm getting into the Sengoku Jidai, I should probably talk about the ninja for a minute. So this question of, were ninja real? Did they exist? This is something that popular culture addresses a lot. And oftentimes it's something you'll see that people take an extreme stance on. Yes, they were real, or no, they were not. If they were not, here's a million and one reasons why. If they were, yeah, they were, but they get mixed up with popular culture in the Edo period, so the 1700s, 1800s. And even still in the modern day, a lot of those popular culture ideas filtered down into modern day pop culture, so it's hard to sift between what's fake and what's actual reality. So The best way I've seen this described, the best way I've seen the ninja phenomenon in the 14 and 1500s described, is that we have these villages in the provinces of Iga and Koga that basically develop Iki self-defense networks between farmers, merchants, and lower-ranking samurai. And Iga and Koga provinces are places that are basically really mountainous. They are heavily forested. If you want to get to one of these villages, you basically have to go along what's known as the tiger paths. So these are very narrow defiles, these are narrow paths and ledges, these are easy to ambush. There are some places where people are only able to walk 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 people abreast. So these self-defense village leagues in Iga and Koga province become very skilled at things like sabotage, they become very skilled at things like assassination and guerrilla warfare because this is the environment they're fighting in. So sometimes these people were contracted out to other lords to go fight for them. Sometimes they tried to extend their power a little bit beyond their villages, really just to protect their own land. If people came into their land, you had to go in with enough soldiers that you were basically able to take enough casualties before you reached the village. So this is probably where the idea of the ninja comes from. This idea of people being skilled in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, etc. It's probably through Iki networks in Iga and Koga provinces. So I mentioned a minute ago that over a 100-year period, roughly between 1360 and 1460, because of stuff like the Hanzei edicts, local lords and leaders had drastically increased their military power, with the result being that the Ashikaga have to work with these local lords to basically be secure in their rule. The problem with this is that in 1464, Ashikagayoshimitsu has no heir, so he convinces his brother Ashikagayoshimitsu, who was a Buddhist monk, to leave the monastery, renounce his vows, and become his heir. So he does this. The problem is that in 1465, Yoshimitsu has a son, Yoshihisha. So does his brother Yoshimi still count as an heir? Well, some of the military families that are using their force to back up Ashikaga rule have a problem with this, and they take very strong stances on this matter. So this results in a succession crisis, which pits powerful Ashikaga backers, specifically the Hosokawa and the Yamana clans, against each other. And between 1467 and 1477, in Kyoto, the Onin War erupts. So the city basically, over a 10-year period, becomes a burned-out husk of trenches and guerrilla warfare. So this is a war which sees the rise of the Ashigaru. So these are peasant foot soldiers who are primarily armed with spears and bows, and it sees the samurai, usually, not always, but usually, shift to a commander role on the battlefield. So there's political chaos in Kyoto for 10 years over who's going to succeed as shogun, and this translates to political chaos in the rest of Japan. So it's during and after this war that Ashikaga control almost completely breaks down, and decentralized rule results. This is not that surprising. So Japan was, at this point, yeah, there's some urbanization going on. Yeah, there's some road structures. There's some road systems. But really, Japan is heavily forested. It's highly mountainous. And it lacks a uniform road system. So if centralized government breaks down, it's not that surprising that local lords would attempt to control their own region. And the localization is also why, during the 1500s, and we'll talk about this more in the second video, that many battles and campaigns are not really long or grand, I guess, in their reach. Nobody's initially, anyway, campaigning to reunify Japan. It's just local conflicts. And this period becomes characterized by this thing called Gekkokujo. So this is sometimes translated as the low overcoming the high, or the low oppressing the high, etc. You kind of get the idea here. Someone from a lower ranking station is going to use force to overthrow somebody from a higher ranking station and basically take over. So the result is that we get the creation of Daimyo. So this means something like great name or big name. These are the new lords that come into the Sengoku Jidai. And we have three forms of Daimyo. We have one form of Daimyo that emerges out of the older Shugo families. So these are what are known as the Shugo Daimyo. We have local leaders who were formerly a vassal to the Shugo, and who then used the policy of Gekkokujo to usurp power. So the Takedo would be an example of this. And then the third way is that we have low-ranking samurai who usurp power via exploiting the political chaos. So the Hojo would be an example of this. Not the Hojo that are dominating the Kamakura Shogunate. This is a different family. So the result is that by 1563, out of 142 major daimyo, only 32 are of the first type. Almost everybody is from the second and third types of daimyo. So it's with this that we leave relative political stability and we enter into the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war.